sometimes you negotiate the deal, you turn it into a lease, and then the tenant comes in, doesn't read the lease, and just signs it. It's really easy as a broker or as a landlord to think, done deal. So anytime anything comes up, the first question is, what's the lease say? The lease doesn't factor in common sense. The lease doesn't factor in being a good neighbor. You agreed to these set of terms, and so it's always, what does the lease say? What we should all do is say, look, let's take the time to go through these terms and make sure we're on the same page. Here's how this can go wrong.
This is Bo Barron, CCIM.
And this is Timmy Barron, ADHD.
I know nothing about commercial real estate.
And I know nothing about acting.
Which is okay, because this is a commercial real estate podcast. So, Bo, you're teaching me everything I don't know about commercial real estate.
This is
commercially speaking. Bo, what are you teaching me today?
Today we're going to talk about leases.
Yay.
And so if you're a commercial real estate investor, what you're buying is the cash flow that a property creates. Commercial real estate in a lot of ways is built upon leases. So what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to throw some lease terms at you.
Yes.
And see, what do you think these things mean?
Yeah, no, I know. I'll tell you what they mean.
Okay. What is land lease?
That's when there is a piece of land and you kind of lay down in it like you would a fleece blanket and soak up the sun. You'd be land leasing.
No. Okay. What about a termination option?
You could go with the lease, or you could have Arnold Schwarzenegger come in and blow it up.
Okay. No. What about holdover?
Holdover. This is something that a lot of spouses do to the other one if they make a mistake, and they use it as leverage.
You're not wrong, but what about exclusivity?
Exclusivity. Oh, this one's easy. It's like the VIP tickets. No one else is allowed to go into this building without your permission.
Okay, you're not way off on that one. What about tenant improvement allowance?
So I guess I could explain it in this way. When you're a kid, your parents are trying to get you to do chores and do things. They'll give you an allowance to improve your behavior. With this, it's the same thing, but you're doing that with your tenants.
So no,
Okay.
Not at all. What about quiet enjoyment?
That's when you kick back, put your feet up, take your shoes off, sip a coffee, a tea, whatever you prefer, and you've got your kids locked in the back room.
That's not it. Mitigation.
Mitigation is easy. Describing it in layman's terms is a little difficult.
All right, next one, counterparts.
So it's like a table. You want to put it together. You take your counterparts and, duct tape or super glue.
Okay.
Then you got a table or counter.
Mm-hmm. No, what about estoppel certificates?
It's when you're trying to stop people from doing anything, those people, you'd call them stoppels. And if you really want them to get out, you give them something like a certificate. And that's what we call stoppel certificates. They think they won something, but no, you got them to quit whatever they were doing.
No. Okay, here's the last one we'll do, and then we'll get into what some of these actually mean.
Great.
Indemnification.
Oh, that's when you verify that somebody is dumb.
Is that what we're doing here today?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
You're indemnificating me.
Let's go through some of these in the context of a lease that I'm actually negotiating right now.
Okay, great.
I have a piece of property. It's a strip center. It's right in the middle of town, and we've got some retailers in there. We've got a medical clinic. We've got some professional office space. And what we've got one of these national financial planner types that kind of takes strip center space, and they want to lease this space. And so they sent me a letter of intent. Have you ever heard of an LOI?
I do not know. I have heard of it.
It allows you to kind of go back and forth on a non-binding agreement to see if there's something to be done here before you engage the process of actually creating a lease document, which might you might start incurring fees there if you're going to use an attorney. It's something to start with. It's a negotiation tool. So I got this LOI. Here it is right here. I'm reading these terms and I'm thinking, no. They were way low on the rent. They're asking for all of this stuff. Just tell them no. I'll deal with the next tenant. Like, not going to do it. They're probably sitting here and think, okay, we're going to ask for everything that we want, and we'll just see what the landlord does. And so I thought, I'm going to flip this around and I'm going to ask for everything that I want and see what they do.
Well. How the turntables.
Nice.
And if they come my direction, we've probably got a deal to be made here. So, for instance, they asked for a 5-year lease. I like that. I want a 5-year lease. That gives me some stability in the center.
Yeah.
Know that I have a long-term tenant. That's great. They wanted some options to renew, which allows them to just notify me at the end of those 5 years, hey, we're going to do another 5 years. And that's great. I like that. But the rent was really low. Like I'm asking $1,750 a square foot. They came in at like $1,543 a foot.
Oh.
And I'm like, no, not going to do that. So I came back, instead of doing $1,750 a square foot for 5 years, I came back with $1,750 a square foot plus 3% rent bumps every year. I'm not going to go through all of this, but here's some other things. They wanted a lease buyout, or what's a termination option. Termination option means they have a 5-year lease, but they wanted the ability to buy out of the lease, or terminate the lease after 2 years. I'm like, why give me a 5-year lease if you can terminate it after 2? Essentially what you're giving me is a 2-year lease.
Right.
And I'm not interested in that. That was a hard no. That was the first thing I read where I was like, nope, not going to do that. Then they wanted exclusivity. Now, these folks are financial planners, but they also do some insurance. So they wanted an exclusive use, meaning I could not lease in that center to anybody else who does financial planning or anybody that does insurance. Well, I've got 2 insurance offices in that center already.
Oh, wow. So you'd have to kick them out, essentially? Okay.
No. I wouldn't have to kick them out, nor could I kick them out. So under the terms of the lease, they have the right to use that space, and the landlord can't kick them out unless they default. And default is like breaking the rules of the lease.
Yeah, okay.
And the lease itself defines, hey, this is what constitutes a default. If a default happens, here's the steps you go through. Here's what the landlord can do. All of that spelled out in the lease. I sent it back to them, no termination option. Not going to do it. And I took that exclusivity clause and I agreed that I wouldn't lease to another financial planner, but I crossed out some of these others like insurance, sales. And then they had this big long list that said, you will not lease to anything on this list. Here's some of the things on the list. Adult videos. Okay. No problem there. Mm-hmm. Abortion offices or facilities, alcohol, drug rehabilitation offices or facilities, off-track betting. But most of these I'm not going to lease to anyway in a center like this. There's a certain type of customer that this center attracts, and I want to be real mindful of the tenant mix that I put in there to protect all of my tenants. But they wanted to know the operating expenses, and we'll get into this in a minute, but this is a triple net lease that I'm trying to get. The tenant pays a base rent, and then I can pass through to them their proportionate share of taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. That's one side of the spectrum of a lease. Okay. On the other side, we have what's called a gross lease, and they are gross, like they're aptly named. But it's the opposite of that. The tenant pays rent and no expenses are passed through.
Yeah.
It all might net out the same. Like a gross lease, generally the rent's going to be higher because the landlord's factoring in taxes, insurance. He's trying to get the rent up because he's not going to be able to pass all this through. Most leases fall somewhere in between. They end up getting negotiated out to where they're somewhere in between, and we might call that a modified gross lease. We might call that a hybrid lease or something. There's all kinds of crazy terms. So in this lease I'm negotiating, this LOI that they sent me, they asked for tenant improvement allowance. Now, I don't know what you guessed that meant before, but what that is they're going to take this space that used to be a Papa Murphy's. It was food prep, but there was...
Sorry, they're asking for, because I think I know what it is. They're asking for money from you so that they can improve the space to make the business more how they would like it, the space more. Like.
So they're going to build out offices in there. They're going to put some walls up. They're going to do this and that, and they're going to turn it into their financial planner office. And the tenant improvement allowance is what they're asking that the landlord give them money. And this can happen a number of different ways. A lot of times when I see a tenant improvement allowance, or what we call TI, I'm used to seeing it as a certain amount of dollars per square foot.
Okay.
And there's a lot of places all over the United States, these big cities, especially with office, is you would expect to see somewhere around $100 a square foot. And the landlords will generally pay these. But in Owensboro, it doesn't happen a lot. And I just said no. And when I got to this clause in the LOI, this is where I was like, I'm not even going to respond to this. No.
Yeah.
And then I thought better of it, and I was like, I'm just going to tell them no. You can take it as is, but I'll give you some free rent. Free rent is nice for a landlord, in my opinion, because I'm not actually taking dollars out of my pocket and handing it over. I'm not losing anything. And then they wanted on the repairs and maintenance, they wanted me to be responsible for just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, nope, this is going to be a triple net lease. You are going to be responsible for your space and the building and your proportionate share of the building.
Yeah.
We made these changes. We sent it back, and they basically said, okay.
Wow.
So we're still negotiating like the final parts, but I'm going to get like 90% of what I wanted. Now, we still haven't turned it into the lease yet.
Sure.
That's a whole nother round of negotiating, because now we're getting into the legal terms and not necessarily the business terms. And there can be some pitfalls. But, man, I just about missed out on something because I really didn't like their offer.
Right.
But instead of just saying no, I was like, I'm going to ask for everything that I want and see what they do. And they came back and basically agreed to everything.
Wow.
Now, I thought they might do that once I thought about it a little bit, because if they want to be in this part of town, they don't have a lot of options. So I understood my market. I understood what the market rents were. They could go to some other places that might be a little bit newer, and they're going to pay significantly more. And I know what those landlords are going to want. So I thought, man, even if I ask for everything that I want here, I bet I can get almost all of it. They agreed to the asking rent that I wanted and the 3% annual bumps.
Yeah.
I am going to give them a termination option after 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a negotiated amount. Like if they pull the trigger on that, then, they got to pay me. They got to buy out a predetermined negotiated amount that they have to pay me. But here's the thing. They're going to put their money into making this office space just like they want it. So they're vested in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think the likelihood that they would terminate the lease is pretty low. And if they do, I'm going to have some pretty nice office space right there. They're going to leave it for me to use for the next person. I like that. So
the risk is very low.
We've leased to this tenant before. You can fully expect that their legal team knows exactly what they're signing.
Sure.
Sometimes we'll do a lease with someone that has less sophistication or less experience, and they misunderstand a lot of the terms, and it causes problems later on. Dealing with some of that right now.
How do you make sure that you all are on the same page without being condescending, or you know what I mean?
Sometimes you negotiate the deal, you turn it into a lease, and then the tenant comes in, doesn't read the lease, and just signs it. It's really easy as a broker or as a landlord to think, done deal. What we should all do is say, look, let's take the time to go through these terms and make sure we're on the same page. Here's how this can go wrong.
Okay.
We have a tenant who's from another country who doesn't speak English very well and has a restaurant in one of our centers. Much like the lease I'm negotiating right now, they wanted tenant improvement allowance. We said no, but we gave them some free rent. So the lease started on this day, but the rent didn't start until later on.
Yeah, okay.
But the lease is in effect. Okay, so like the triple net charges started when the lease commenced. This guy says, no, I had free rent for a period of months, so I don't owe any of that other stuff either.
Oof.
And he's wrong about it. And he is refusing to pay. So he's actually in default. And so under the terms of the lease, we might have to go through this process of potentially kicking this guy out.
Yeah.
Because he misunderstood. Now, at this point, I think he's a difficult fella, and he just doesn't want to pay. And he keeps telling us that his attorney says he doesn't have to pay. And I'm thinking, no way. And he won't tell me who the attorney is. He's using it as an excuse, I think. But we're dealing with that right now because we didn't sit down with him. And actually, we bought this center right after this guy signed a lease with the previous owner. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really have an opportunity to go through the lease.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
And sometimes things that you would, like common sense would tell you, this is how you should handle something. isn't how the lease is written. I'll give you another example.
Okay.
So we have all this water coming into the parking lot.
Okay.
Right? It's the water that feeds a particular tenant, but it's outside their space under the parking lot is where the problem is.
Oh.
So whose responsibility should that be? Common sense would tell you, it's not their responsibility. They didn't put that in. They don't have any ability to maintain that or
They didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, that's right.
It's not even in their space, but that's not how the lease was written. The lease was written that any of the utilities serving their space were their responsibility. And so this tenant had to pay for that to be fixed.
Oof.
And that's how the lease is written. So anytime anything comes up, at our company, the first question is, what's the lease say? The lease doesn't factor in common sense. The lease doesn't factor in being a good neighbor.
Right.
You agreed to these set of terms, and the lease governs. And so it's always, what does the lease say? If it's been 3 years since anybody looked at that lease, and the tenant is like, and that's not my responsibility, that's out in the parking lot.
Yeah.
I mean, like, man, I see why you would think that. That makes sense, but that's not what the lease says. Let me show you what it says. And I'm sorry to deliver this news, but this is your responsibility. No.
Yeah. Oh, that sucks because, oh man, you can clearly see common sense says something different.
Everything should be defined, but you can't really think of everything in advance.
Right.
And so sometimes the wording in a lease is poorly written, or, a unique circumstance comes up that wasn't anticipated in the lease. Here's another example.
Okay.
We just sold a building last week. It's an investment office building. The tenant in there, it's kind of a daycare facility. A new group came in and bought it. So now they're the landlords. But while the deal was under contract, the sewer backed up in the building. Like, bleh, gross.
That's a gross lease.
So the lease says that everything outside the building is the landlord's responsibility, including the roof and the structure, okay? Mm-hmm. So if there's a roof leak, it's the landlord's responsibility. The parking lot maintenance itself is the landlord's responsibility. But anything inside the building is the tenant's responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But when it listed the things in the lease that said, okay, here's the tenant's responsibility, all the stuff inside the building to include the plumbing.
So it didn't include the plumbing in the lease?
No, it put the plumbing, that is the tenant's responsibility. But the issue with the plumbing happened outside the building.
Oh.
On the way to the street. And so now the landlord's saying, well, the plumbing is part of the tenant's responsibility. And the tenant's like, this happened outside the building. There's a dispute because the lease language wasn't written well to handle this particular situation.
Right.
And it's hard to anticipate all the potential situations. Now there's an issue. But now we have a new owner of the building. And so it's gotten even a little bit more complicated. And we actually had to escrow some of the proceeds that would have gone to the seller. They held back enough money to fix this problem that's being held in escrow. And once the problem's fixed, regardless of who ends up paying for it, that money is released to the seller. And if it doesn't get fixed over a particular amount of time, that escrowed money will go to the buyer because now it'll be their problem.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to what the lease says. So it's really important to understand so let me just take a few minutes and roll through some of these terms that I put to you at the beginning of the episode, and we'll actually talk about what these things mean.
Great.
Okay. So we talked about a land lease. A land lease is where you actually lease the land and then you build something on it. Let's say you're a tenant.
Sure.
And you'll go lease 5 acres, and then you, at your expense, will build something that you actually own on top of it. And these land leases are generally very long. Like sometimes they're 99 years. Because if you own the building, you want to make sure you have control of the land, the useful life of the building. And if the land lease runs out, because sometimes these are 20-year land leases with 4 20-year options, so they can go out to 100 years. Well, if you don't renew the land lease, the building goes to the owner of the dirt.
Whoa.
But that's what a land lease is. You actually lease the dirt, and then you do what you want at your expense on top of the dirt.
Yeah.
Whatever your plans are. All right, a termination option we talked about.
Yeah, I can tell you what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, termination option. Yeah, it's they have the option to get out of the lease before, like it's a 5-year lease. They could get out after a certain amount of time, whatever the termination option. After 2 years, you could terminate it, and you all typically negotiate the cost of the termination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it needs to cost the tenant something if they want to terminate the lease, but it's all based on what that clause says in the lease. All right, we mentioned a holdover. What a holdover is let's say you have a 5-year lease and that lease expires, but you didn't renew it, but you're still there. Mm-hmm. The holdover clause handles, all right, what happens if the lease runs out and the tenant doesn't renew, but they're still operating in the space? It's like they're squatters now.
Right.
So the holdover clause will state normally some version of it'll automatically renew for another year, or it might go month to month and all other terms of the lease stay in full force and effect. And it just turns into a month-to-month lease. And month-to-month leases really hurt the value of the property because you can't count on that rent in the future. Mm-hmm. Can't count on it at all. They could be gone in a month.
Right.
So it hurts the value. Landlords don't like that. So oftentimes I will say, okay, if you go into a holdover situation, your rent will go up 150%. So if it was $10 a square foot, now it's $15. I need you to leave so I can find another tenant, or I need you to renew. And if you don't, it's going to cost you. So holdover, that's what a holdover clause is. Repairs and maintenance, we've talked about that a little bit, but that section defines who's responsible for what. Quiet enjoyment. It's the clause that says, Mr. Landlord, I'm paying my rent. I'm doing what I'm doing. Now leave me alone and let me operate my business.
Yeah.
Okay. In that situation I was telling you about before with the sale where there was the plumbing issue.
Yeah.
And the sewer backed up and there's a dispute about who's responsible for it. The landlord at first was just going to fix it on his expense. And he got a bid and he informed the tenant, hey, we're going to do it. It's going to take 2 days. They were going to have to shut down their business for a couple of days. Well, they sent him a certified letter from their attorney that said, no. You have to do this on the weekend or you're violating our quiet enjoyment clause. And I was like, I don't know about that. And so at that point, he read the lease a little closer and we talked about it a little bit. And he's like, I think I can make a case where this is their responsibility in the first place. Oh. If they want to act like this to me, I'm going to throw it back at them.
Oh, boy.
Quiet enjoyment just means the landlord's going to leave the tenant alone unless they violate the lease or go into default, and is going to allow them to operate their business.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Signage clauses. This can be really interesting, especially in strip centers, also in office buildings. Does the tenant have the right to put a sign on the building? Well, strip centers, yes, but the landlord generally wants control over what kind of sign they put in, and they might want a consistent look or feel.
Right.
And so the signage clause in a lease tells you what's what. Well, I heard a story yesterday. This is so funny.
Story time.
Imagine a strip center. You know, all the signs generally are fairly consistent.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what you want. And so this personal injury attorney was going to be the tenant. All right. Think, I don't know, Saul Goodman. And they pulled the signage language from another lease. And that other lease that they pulled the language from allowed for a much bigger sign. And they just missed it. They didn't pay attention. And so the personal injury attorney, the tenant, took that language, gave it to his sign guy, and, you know, it was an executed lease. Everybody agreed on this, even though it was missed. And so you have a strip center, these consistent signs, and then the personal injury attorney has this sign that's like 3 times bigger than everybody. And the personal injury attorney, man, he was like, I'm not changing that sign.
Yeah.
Mitigation, we talked about mitigation. The mitigation clause says this: if you sign a 5-year lease as the tenant and I'm the landlord essentially takes on the responsibility of mitigating the potential losses that a tenant has if they move out or shut down or whatever the case is. It's the responsibility of the landlord to take their best efforts, their normal efforts in trying to lease that space. Okay. So for instance, right now, I have my tenant who's bought a building and is moving out. I have 2 spaces in that center, right? Now, it would not be okay for me to focus all my efforts on leasing out the vacant space and not showing his space because he's still going to pay me rent for 2 years. I should be trying to get a tenant for both of them.
Yeah.
That's what that clause says that I'll do.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, also at the beginning, mentioned estoppel certificates. Now imagine this. Imagine I'm going to go buy a strip center, and the seller, the landlord, we put it under contract. He sends me all the leases, and I get to see, okay, what leases are in place. Well, what if he's lying to me? So a lot of times what the estoppel certificate clause says is that within 30 days of the landlord's request, the tenant will certify that their lease is in full force and effect and verify the terms of the lease. Generally, you do that for a new buyer, or you might have to do that for the lender. The lender might want to see that stuff. And then I think the last one we talked about was indemnification. Somebody gets sued in your store, you're going to do what you can to protect the landlord from that suit. It might just say that the landlord will indemnify the tenant, and the tenant doesn't agree to indemnify the landlord, or generally you want that going both ways, but that's what that clause means. And then there's also this clause called counterparts. Counterparts says if you print out the lease in Chicago and I print out the lease here in Owensboro, you sign that one, I sign another one.
So same lease, just not the same physical.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. And I've only just scratched the surface, by the way. Like, there are lots of other clauses that go into leases, and depending on who you're dealing with, I've seen 40-page leases, I've seen 3-page leases. Mm-hmm. It really just depends, but it can be a big stinking mess and a lot to read through.
Yeah,
especially if all these terms are new to you.
Right. And most of these terms, a residential real estate agent wouldn't typically have to deal with or have any reason to know. Is that true?
They wouldn't necessarily be ignorant all the way around of leases, but a lot of this is going to be new information. Yeah. Right.
Well, I'm curious if there's anybody watching on YouTube or listening on whatever podcast platform, if you were familiar with leases, or if there's one that you're like, oh, this one is, which lease term do you think is the most misused, overlooked in your experience, especially if you're an investor or a broker? I'm just curious of what other people think. Why did you choose these particular terms, Bo? Is it because it's what's kind of what you're negotiating or what's active right now for you, or what would you say?
Well, these are a mix of some of the more general terms that you're going to find in most leases, or the most misunderstood or unique to commercial leases, or just somewhat interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
One, I don't know if I could come up with every lease term or every lease clause.
Right.
Somebody's going to invent another one. There's no rules on this stuff, You can make the lease say whatever you want it to say. Whatever you can agree on is what the lease is. So there's not always, there's normal, this is usually in a lease, and it's really whatever the landlord and the tenant agree to and negotiate out. That's what ends up being in a lease.
Cool. Hey, I've got an idea for the pop quiz. What do you think of a rapid fire pop quiz where you list what you listed to me at the very beginning, and I have to quickly say what they actually are now?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, great. While Bo's getting that ready, you can play another quickie quiz right here. This is my favorite part of the show because this is where I can impress Bo, whatever guests we have, at how well I was listening.
Okay, rapid fire quiz. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Land lease.
Land lease is when you lease the land, and that's pretty much it. Everything that I would build, if I lease that land, if I build on top of it, all that's mine. I own that. And they're typically, it's not unusual for them to be 90 or 100-year lease. You don't really want that to run out, because then everything I built would then be yours if you're the owner of the land.
That's exactly right. All right. Great. Termination option.
If I'm leasing for 5 years, at 2 years, I've got the option to get out after a negotiated cost of price of terminate. Yeah. You terminate it. You got the option to terminate it in less time than early. Yep. There's the word.
It's good. All right. What's a holdover?
Me being a tenant, if I do not renew the lease, but I'm still operating out of it, there are the holdover clauses in place to, in your case, rent go up 150%. Month to month or a year, but it's something to protect you, the landlord, from them just operating with no lease in place. Oftentimes the lease terms stay the same except for what's negotiated.
Yep. Good. What about an exclusivity clause?
That means that if I would want an inclusivity clause as a tenant, I don't want other businesses that are in the...
Did you just say inclusivity?
I think so. What is it?
Exclusivity.
Exclusivity.
Opposite of that.
I tell you, a lot of times the words do not match what I'm thinking, especially after you just said it. Exclusivity. So I'm an insurance business. I want to be the exclusive insurance business in this strip. So I'm going to go for an exclusivity clause so you agree not to rent to other insurance companies. Here's an example.
Yeah, good example. Oftentimes, you might have a grocer who says nobody else in the center can sell sandwiches. Or it can get really specific. So yeah, that's exactly what that is. What's a tenant improvement allowance?
That's when the tenant wants the landlord to give them money to help them build out their space in the way that they would like.
That's exactly right. Yep. Now, I didn't mention this before, but sometimes the landlord will get that back over the course of the lease. Like it'll be additional rent as they pay that back. Oh. Sometimes it's just a payment from the landlord to the tenant. All right, what are estoppel certificates?
Oh, damn. Oh, man.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you the next one, and then maybe it'll come to you. We'll come back to it.
Oh, you need real info. It's going to verify. The tenants in the space are going to verify that the landlord is telling you the truth.
Yeah, they're essentially going to verify that their leases are
what the landlord
force in effect.
Okay.
And this is what we're paying in rent. This is how much term. They're going to verify. Yeah. Good.
Great.
Yeah, nice.
There you go.
Now, last one. What's indemnification?
You pretty much, you've got each other's back, the tenant and the landlord, where it's like, if someone slips in the parking lot, I'm going to protect you. Somebody slips inside my business, you're going to protect me from all the legal ramifications of what could happen.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Nicely done, man. I think you got them all.
Yeah, I think so too. I did. Yeah, but we're talking ChatGPT maybe in the next episode that people hear.
Yeah. Yep. And
Cool.
man, I've had ChatGPT do some funny things.
I can't
Yep.
wait. I can't wait. All right, brother. All right, I love you.
Love you too. I'll see you.
Please do all the things that podcasts ask you to do. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, notification bell, leave us a comment of any questions, thoughts. And of course, you can find us on all these social media channels at Commercially Speaking. If you want more and access to bonus content or a place that shows you everywhere we are on the internet, just hit the first link in the show notes. But above everything else, thank you for joining Bo Barron, CCIM, and me, Timmy Barron, ADHD, the actor.